In a family that gave the world some of the biggest moments in pop history, they also gave the world some of the biggest scandals. Joe Jackson's iron fist and complicated legacy, Jermaine's jealousy that nearly tore the group apart, LaToya's shocking press conferences, Randy's legal troubles, Tito's heartbreak, Jackie's tabloid affairs, and then Michael, the most famous, the most scrutinized, the most misunderstood human being on the planet. When you run through the Jackson family tree, it's almost hard to find a name without a controversy attached to it. Almost because tucked in the middle of all that chaos, the sixth of 10 children, the one the cameras rarely focused on, the one the tabloids rarely called, is a man who somehow walked through one of the most turbulent family stories in entertainment history without a single scandal sticking to his name. His name is Marlon Jackson. And if you're already thinking, wait, which one was he again? That's actually kind of the point. Today on Jackson Rewind, we're pulling back the curtain on the brother who stayed clean, the man who lost a twin at birth, found his other half in Michael, watched everything fall apart, and still managed to keep his head above water when everyone around him was drowning. Stay with me. Because Marlon's story is quieter than his brother's. But in a lot of ways, it hits harder. The boy who arrived without his brother to understand Marlon Jackson. You have to start at the beginning. And the beginning is one of the saddest stories in the entire Jackson family history, and that's saying something. March 12, 1957, Gary, Indiana, Katherine Jackson gives birth to twins, Marlon David Jackson and his brother Brandon. They were premature, born too early, and while Marlon survived, Brandon didn't make it through the first 24 hours. Respiratory failure, gone before he ever had a chance to breathe. Marlon came into this world having already lost someone. Think about that for a second. He never knew his twin, never got to grow up alongside him, never got to share that bond that twins describe, that feeling of having someone who is almost literally the other half of you. He didn't just lose a brother, he lost the person who was supposed to be his mirror. Joe and Katherine never made a huge public thing about Brandon. The family grieved privately, the way working-class families in Gary, Indiana tended to do. You didn't have the luxury of falling apart. You kept moving. But Marlon carried that absence with him. And in the years that followed, he quietly transferred some of that bond. That need for a twin, a mirror, a partner, onto the next brother born into the family, Michael Jackson. Born August 29th, 1958, 17 months younger than Marlon. The two of them became inseparable. In the Jackson household, you belonged to a pack. There were ultimately 9 surviving children, and they all had their alliances, their rivalries, their dynamics. But Marlon and Michael were different. They were close in age, they shared a bedroom, they shared a sense of humour, and they shared a mischievous streak that got them in trouble more than once. Marlon himself said it plainly. Michael was his substitute twin. That's not a small thing to say. That's a man telling you that the little brother born after his grief became the person who filled the hole left by a brother he never got to know. It also helps explain something that a lot of fans miss when they study the Jackson family, why Marlon's relationship with Michael was different from the other brothers. Jermaine had his own rivalry and his own ambition. Jackie was the eldest and always had some distance. Tito was steady. Randy was the youngest brother, always trying to prove himself. But Marlon? Marlon and Michael were just close. Simply, genuinely close. No complicated layers, no professional jealousy, just brothers. The forgotten Jackson who never forgot the work by 1964, the Jackson Family Act was starting to take shape. Jackie, Tito and Jermaine had been playing around with music for a couple of years, and Joe Jackson, who was quietly building something even if nobody fully understood the scale of it yet, decided it was time to add the younger boys. Marlon and Michael joined the group. Now here's something that the documentaries and the tribute shows almost always skip over, and it's actually important. Marlon wasn't a natural. Michael was. From the jump, Michael had this almost supernatural sense of rhythm and pitch. He was 7 years old and already performing like someone twice his age. Joe saw it. Everyone saw it. Marlon was different. He had trouble keeping up with the dance steps. He struggled to hit the vocals the way the routine demanded. In a family act where Joe Jackson ran rehearsals like military drills, where getting it wrong meant getting in trouble, Marlon had to work for what Michael seemed to absorb naturally. And he did the work. That's the thing that nobody talks about. Marlon didn't fold. He didn't step back and let his more gifted brothers carry it. He put in the hours. He refined his dancing. He developed his voice. And by the time the Jackson 5 was performing on the Chitlin circuit, grinding through talent shows across Indiana and earning their reputation the hard way, Marlon had earned his place not through raw talent, but through sheer determination. His brothers actually gave him a nickname: the Dancing Guest Jackson. They came up with it on the Carol Burnett show when the host asked each of them to describe themselves in a word, and every single brother agreed that Marlon's whole thing was dancing. Not just that he was good at it, that he was the one who loved it most, who gave himself over to it, who became the lead choreographer behind some of the group's signature moves. Think about how significant that is. Michael Jackson, the man who would eventually be called the greatest dancer in pop history, and his brothers unanimously said Marlon was the dancingest one. That tells you something about what Marlon brought to those stages. By the time Motown came calling in 1969, the Jackson 5 had developed into a genuine machine. Joe Jackson had built something, and Berry Gordy had the infrastructure to take it global. Their debut run at Motown is still legendary. 4 consecutive #1 singles right out of the gate. I Want You Back. ABC, The Love You Save, I'll Be There. That doesn't happen. That has essentially never happened before or since in that way. Marlon wasn't the frontman. He wasn't lead vocalist. He played conga, he played tambourine, he sang background, and he was one of the key dancers in a group where the visual presentation was just as important as the music. He understood his role. He didn't push against it. He made himself invaluable in a group that already had a star at its centre. That kind of quiet professionalism? That's actually rare. The transition, the turmoil, A&D staying steady by the mid-1970s, cracks were forming in the structure that had held the Jackson family together. The Motown years had been commercially explosive, but privately the brothers were growing restless. They weren't getting the creative control they wanted. The royalty situation wasn't what it should have been. And Joe Jackson, always the strategist, was pushing for a move. In 1975, the Jackson 5 made one of the boldest business decisions of their careers and left Motown for Epic Records. And that decision immediately cost them something they hadn't accounted for: their name. Berry Gordy had trademarked the Jackson 5. When they walked out the door, they walked out without the name they'd built. That stung. And then came the other blow. Jermaine, Marlon's brother, the one who had married Berry Gordy's daughter Diana Ross Holland, chose to stay at Motown. He wasn't leaving. The family act fractured along a very real fault line. The remaining brothers recruited Randy, the youngest of the brothers, and rebranded as simply the Jacksons. They signed with Epic. They started over. This is the period where the Jackson family dynamics started getting genuinely complicated. Jermaine's decision to stay behind felt like a betrayal to some of the brothers. Joe Jackson was furious. The press had a field day. And meanwhile, Michael was quietly beginning to think about what his future looked like outside the group. But Marlon? Marlon kept his head down and did the work. The Jacksons period actually produced some really underrated music. The 1978 album Destiny and the 1980 album Triumph, these were records where the brothers had creative control for the first time and they showed what they were capable of. Marlon co-wrote Body, one of the standout tracks from their 1984 album Victory. He was contributing creatively in ways that the spotlight rarely acknowledged. And then came the Victory Tour of 1984. And everything started to come undone. The Victory Tour was one of the biggest concert tours of its era. On paper. In reality, it was a logistical and interpersonal disaster. Don King, the infamous boxing promoter, was initially brought in on the marketing side and immediately created chaos. The ticketing system was a fiasco that the press hammered relentlessly. Jackie suffered a serious leg injury. There was friction between the brothers, rumours about money, rumours about Michael's growing disconnection from the group. Michael was done. Everyone could see it. By the time the Victory Tour wrapped up at Dodger Stadium in December 1984, Michael announced he was leaving. His solo career, which had already produced Thriller, the best-selling album of all time, was his priority now. And then, a few months later, Marlon also announced he was leaving. It was a quieter announcement. It didn't generate nearly the headlines Michael's departure did, but it was still a significant moment. Marlon had given his career to this group. He'd been there from the rehearsal room in Gary. He'd given up a normal childhood, normal teenage years, normal early adulthood, to be part of this family machine. And now he was stepping away to figure out who he was on his own. The solo career, the pivot, and the choice nobody talks about in 1987, Marlon Jackson released his debut solo album. It was called Baby Tonight. The lead single, Don't Go, reached number 2 on the US R&B charts. He performed it on the Arsenio Hall show to an enthusiastic audience. He was charming. He was polished. He was clearly ready for this moment. He said in that interview what a lot of people already suspected. I've always wanted to do a solo album. I've always wanted to pursue a solo career. Baby Tonight wasn't a massive commercial crossover hit, but it was a solid R&B record. It connected with an audience, and it showed Marlon had something real to offer outside the group context. And then Marlon Jackson did something that almost no major pop artist does. He walked away. Not out of failure, not out of scandal, not because the industry rejected him. He looked at what the music business asked of people, what it had asked of his brothers, what it had done to Michael even as it elevated him to godlike status, and he made a deliberate choice to step back. By the early 1990s, Marlon was out of the spotlight entirely. He had moved into real estate in Southern California, and he was good at it. He built a genuine career in property. He wasn't struggling, he wasn't fading out in undignified ways. He wasn't chasing something that had already passed him by. He made a conscious pivot. In 1999, he went even further. He co-founded the major broadcasting cable network, NBC, along with partners including Florida attorney Willie Gary, boxer Evander Holyfield, and baseball player Cecil Fielder. This was the first minority-owned and operated cable network of its kind. In 3 years, they built the network to reach more than 15 million homes. In 2004, it rebranded as the Black Family Channel, and in 2007 it was sold to what eventually became Up TV. This is not the biography of a man who couldn't handle the spotlight. This is the biography of a man who decided very clearly that the spotlight wasn't everything, that there was a version of a good life that didn't require your name in the tabloids every week. And while he was building businesses, he was also doing something even more remarkable for someone from this family. He was being a husband and a father. The marriage that broke the Jackson mold in August 1975, 18-year-old Marlon Jackson married Carol Ann Parker. They had met on tour in New Orleans during one of the Jacksons' road swings. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't in the industry. She was a young woman he met while traveling the country as part of one of the most famous musical acts in America. And somewhere in New Orleans, something clicked. They married in August 1975. They went on to have 3 children: Valencia, born in 1976, Brittany, born in 1978, and Marlon Jr., born in 1981. They now have grandchildren. And here is the fact that should make your jaw drop when you look at it in the context of this family. Marlon and Carol are still married, today, in 2026. Over 50 years. Let that land. Look at the rest of the Jackson siblings. Jackie married twice, had public affairs, spent time in the tabloids over messy splits. Jermaine has been married 3 times and has children with multiple women. LaToya's marriage to Jack Gordon was one of the most disturbing and complicated situations in the whole family story. Randy has had multiple relationships, multiple children, multiple legal complications. Michael's 2 marriages were brief, complex, and very public. Meanwhile, Marlon has been with the same woman for over half a century. This is not a small thing in any industry. In entertainment, where the pressures of fame, money, travel, and access to temptation are relentless, long marriages are genuinely rare. In the Jackson family specifically, where the pattern of complicated romantic lives runs deep across almost every sibling, Marlon's marriage stands as almost a statistical anomaly. His sister Rebby is the only other Jackson sibling who has never divorced. She was married to Nathaniel Brown from 1968 until his death in 2013. 2 siblings out of 9. That's how rare this is, and it matters not just as a personal achievement, but as a statement about who Marlon Jackson is as a man. He could have lived differently. He had access to every kind of excess. He was famous. He was wealthy. He moved through a world where that combination opens basically every door you can imagine. He chose Carol. He chose his family. He chose the quieter life. The moment he broke the world's heart, July 7th, 2009, Staples Center, Los Angeles. 1 billion people around the world watched Michael Jackson's memorial service. Every major media outlet on earth was covering it. The brothers sat in the front row, each wearing a single white sequin glove in tribute to their brother. When it came time for the family to speak, Marlon stepped to the microphone. He talked about Michael as a child. He talked about the ways they grew up together, the ways Michael had tried to experience normal life, and the ways the world had made that impossible. He told a story about once seeing a man in a record store wearing a rumpled disguise and walking up behind him to say, "Michael, what are you doing?" The man turned around and said, "Marlon, how did you know it was me?" And Marlon told him, "You're my brother. I know your walk. I know your body language." And the shoes didn't help. The crowd laughed through tears, and then Marlon said the line that cut through everything else that day. "Maybe now, Michael, they will leave you alone." His sister Janet, standing nearby, nodded. That line landed because it came from a place of deep, genuine grief, the frustration of a brother who had watched the person closest to him get scrutinized, judged, ridiculed, and torn apart by the world for decades. Not a PR statement, not a prepared talking point, just a brother saying the quiet part out loud. And then Marlon did something that nobody quite expected. He ended his eulogy not just by saying goodbye to Michael, but by connecting Michael to the loss that had defined Marlon's own life from his very first breath. He said, "I have one request, Michael. I would like for you to give our brother, my twin brother, Brandon, a hug for me." There it was, the loss he'd carried since 1957. The twin who died within 24 hours, the hole that had never fully closed. And now Michael, the brother who had in some quiet, unspoken way filled that hole, was gone too. If you want to understand Marlon Jackson in a single moment, that's the one. The life he built, and why it matters since losing Michael, Marlon has continued to live life on his own quiet terms. He's still involved with the Jacksons as a performing unit. The surviving brothers have done reunion shows and tours in the years since 2009. In August 2025, Marlon and Jackie returned to Gary, Indiana for a 2-day block party organised by the city on the anniversary of Michael's birth, honouring the group's legacy in the place where it all started. He runs the Marlon Jackson Study Peace Foundation, an organisation focused on bringing peace and unity to communities, with programs specifically designed to engage young people. He's been working on a documentary about Joe Jackson, the man who drove all of them, who was feared and respected and complicated in equal measure, trying to give his father a more nuanced legacy than the media often allows. He's still married to Carol. He's a grandfather. He's not in the tabloids. Now here's why all of this matters in the larger Jackson story. When we talk about this family, we naturally gravitate toward the extremes. Michael's genius and his tragedy, Jermaine's rivalry and his betrayals. LaToya's years of estrangement and her tell-all, the chaos around Joe, the legal battles, the estrangements, the dramatic public moments. Marlon is the counterweight to all of that. He's the proof that the same environment, the same childhood, the same pressures, the same father, the same machine, didn't necessarily produce the same outcomes. That choices still matter. That character still matters, that you can come out of the fire without getting burned. He lost a twin at birth. He found his twin in Michael, and then lost him too. He grew up under Joe Jackson's notoriously demanding roof. He spent his childhood and his teenage years and his early adulthood as part of one of the most intense entertainment operations in history. He navigated the industry, the money, the fame, the temptation, the chaos, and he came out the other side with his marriage intact, his kids raised right, his reputation clean, and his head on straight. That is not the easiest thing to do in any life. In this family, it might be the hardest. The Jacksons gave the world extraordinary music, extraordinary talent, and with all of that, an extraordinary amount of very human mess, the kind of mess that comes when unimaginable pressure meets real family dynamics over decades. But Marlon Jackson quietly tells a different story, a story about showing up, doing the work, loving your wife, raising your kids, building something real, grieving privately, and getting back up. He was never the most famous, never the most scrutinized, never the one the cameras chased, and in this family, in this industry, in this world, that might actually be the most remarkable thing about him. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know we try to look at these stories from every angle. Not just the peaks and the scandals, but the full picture. Marlon Jackson is the full picture. Drop a comment below. Who do you think is the most underrated Jackson sibling, and why? I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. We go deep on these stories every week. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, and we'll see you in the next one. This is Jackson Rewind. The legacy, the music, the story.